What if I told you that the tanks you see in movies, those hulking beasts of steel, weren't even close to the deadliest or most dangerous weapons of World War II? In fact, some of the most iconic tanks were outclassed, outmaneuvered, and outthought by tanks that were faster, smarter, and built for survival, not just firepower. The real story of World War II warfare isn't about the biggest guns or thickest armor. It's about brutal tactics that changed the course of history forever. And some of what you think you might know might just be a myth. Because the evolution of tanks in World War II was a bloody, relentless race for supremacy, and the winners weren't always who you'd expect. When World War II started, most armies still weren't quite sure of how to use tanks the right way. In places like Britain and France, tanks were treated more like heavy backup. They rolled behind marching soldiers, moving slow and steady, almost like armored support wagons. Some generals, stuck in old ways of thinking, even pictured tanks like cavalry, charging ahead in brave, scattered attacks. But while other countries hesitated, Germany had been quietly learning, and when the time came, they were ready to turn everything upside down. Looking closely at what had gone wrong in the last war, German commanders like Heinz Guderian pushed a bold new era. Instead of tanks waiting for infantry to move forward, why not try something new? Tanks would go first, punching holes straight through enemy lines. Behind them, mobile infantry, artillery, and aircraft would keep the attack rolling. It wasn't just about tanks, it was about fast, crushing teamwork, all tied together by radios that kept everyone moving as one. They called it Blitzkrieg, or Lightning War, and when they unleashed it, most of Europe simply wasn't ready. The tanks that powered Germany's Blitzkrieg, like the Panzer III and Panzer IV, weren't necessarily the toughest or the most heavily armed. On paper, some Allied tanks even looked stronger. But what made the German tanks deadly wasn't just their armor or guns, it was how they were used. Every German tank came with a radio, something that seems basic now but was a game changer back then. Commanders could talk to each other in real time, shifting attacks, calling for backup, or changing direction the moment the battlefield shifted. Instead of moving blindly and hoping for the best, German tank crews could think and move like a single fast-moving team. That edge proved devastating during the invasions of Poland, Denmark, Norway, the Low Countries, and France. Whole armies were outflanked and smashed before they even had a chance to react. On the other side, the British and French weren't so lucky. Their tanks were often stretched too thin across long fronts. Many didn't even have radios. Crews had to rely on waving flags or hand signals. Fine for a parade ground, but a disaster once bullets started flying. Even tanks like the French Char B1, which had thicker armor and bigger guns than many early German models, ended up losing the advantage. Deployed in scattered groups, with little communication and no coordinated attacks, they were picked off one by one. The Germans showed that how you used tanks was just as important, if not more important, than how tough your tank actually was. But early victories didn't mean German tank tactics were unbeatable. When fighting moved to North Africa, everything changed. Gone were the muddy trenches and narrow roads of Europe. Now tanks had to fight across endless stretches of desert, under a brutal sun with no cover for miles. Speed, endurance, and knowing how to keep your tanks running became just as important as firepower. In this new environment, tank warfare hit a new level of complexity and danger. The British struggled at first. Their Matilda II tanks could take a beating, but they were painfully slow, crawling across the desert while German forces zipped around them. Erwin Rommel, the famous desert fox, turned the desert into a deadly playground for his Afrika Korps. Using Panzer IIIs and IVs, Rommel's forces moved fast, striking from unexpected angles, slipping away before the British could even line up a shot. In the desert, a tank that broke down was almost as good as lost. Mechanics became as important as gunners, because a dead engine could mean the end of the crew. With losses mounting and the desert war slipping away, Britain turned to America for help. The answer came in the form of the M4 Sherman. When the Sherman rolled onto North African battlefields in late 1942, it wasn't perfect. It stood tall, making it an easy target, and its 75mm gun sometimes struggled against heavier German armor. But the Sherman had something that mattered even more. It worked. It was reliable, easy to fix, even in the middle of nowhere, and fast enough to stay in the fight. Best of all, American factories could churn them out by the thousands. Germany had clever tanks. The Allies were about to show what could happen when you combined good tanks with overwhelming numbers. The real power shift in the war didn't just come from better tanks. It came from building more of them. Germany struggled to keep up, trying to crank out enough Panzer IVs, Panthers, and Tigers. Meanwhile, American factories were rolling Shermans off the assembly lines by the thousands. And these Shermans didn't just fight under US flags, they showed up with British forces, Free French troops, and even rolled into battle painted with Soviet stars. Quantity wasn't the only advantage, but keeping the pressure on day after day, battle after battle, made a difference Germany couldn't overcome. While Shermans flooded the Western Front, a whole different kind of war was raging in the East. When Germany launched Operation Barbarossa in 1941, they expected a quick, brutal victory over the Soviet Union. What they got instead was a nasty shock: the T-34. The Soviet T-34 wasn't just good. It was a tank built for survival. Sloped armor helped deflect enemy shells. A 76.2mm gun packed enough punch to tear through German armor. Wide tracks let it cut across mud, snow, and ice where German vehicles got stuck. The T-34 didn't just fight, it thrived in the brutal conditions of the Eastern Front. At first, the Red Army was a mess. Stalin's purges had guilted military leadership, and Soviet tank crews often had little training. Early battles were disasters, but the Soviets adapted fast. By 1942, factories like Tankograd at Chelyabinsk were pumping out T-34s faster than the Germans could destroy them. Newer versions like the T-34-85 upgraded the gun to stay deadly against Germany's growing tank threats. Germany scrambled to respond. Their answer was the Panther, a tank that copied the T-34's sloped armor but made it thicker and armed it with a powerful 75mm gun. Then came the Tiger I, a monstrous machine packing an 88mm cannon that could destroy almost anything it faced. On paper, the Panther and Tiger looked unbeatable. On the battlefield, they were terrifying, but they came at a cost. They were heavy, complicated, and broke down easily. Germany's factories simply couldn't build enough to keep up. The real test came in the summer of 1943 at Kursk, the largest tank battle in history. Over 6,000 tanks clashed across the open fields. Panthers and Tigers tore into Soviet units, causing horrific losses. But the Soviets had prepared. Minefields, trenches, anti-tank guns, and endless waves of fresh tanks ground the German offensive to a halt. Kursk was a disaster for Germany. After that, they were always on the back foot, retreating as Soviet armor began its unstoppable push west. Meanwhile, on the Western Front, tank battles took a new deadly twist. After storming the beaches of Normandy in June 1944, Allied tanks found themselves fighting through thick hedgerows instead of open fields. The Bocage country was a nightmare, tight, twisting lanes and earthen walls perfect for ambushes. German guns and panzers waited behind every corner, and Shermans paid the price. Losses were heavy. The Shermans' thinner armor stood no chance against hidden 88mm guns or Panthers lying in wait, but the Allies adapted fast. The British fielded the Sherman Firefly, packing a high-velocity 17-pounder gun that could punch straight through a Panther's armor. American crews welded hedge cutters to their tanks, turning the Bocage from a trap into an obstacle they could smash through. Tanks kept evolving. Engineers turned Shermans into flamethrower tanks for clearing bunkers, mine flail tanks for blasting paths through deadly minefields, and amphibious DD tanks for floating across rivers and storming beaches. Tanks were no longer just weapons. They were flexible tools that could be reshaped for any battle, any threat. As the Allies closed in on Germany, the fighting shifted into cities, and tanks found themselves trapped in brutal urban warfare. In places like Aachen and Cologne, tanks that once ruled open fields were now boxed into narrow streets, easy targets for Panzerfausts and hidden guns. Survival meant working closely with infantry, clearing every building, every alley, step by bloody step. The battlefield had changed again, and tanks had to change with it. On the Eastern Front, the Red Army took everything they had learned and turned it into a relentless machine. Waves of T-34s rolled forward, smashing into German lines behind crushing artillery barrages. Infantry moved up close behind, clearing out pockets of resistance, while mobile anti-tank guns covered the flanks. By 1945, Soviet tanks were unstoppable. When the Red Army stormed into Berlin, they brought not just numbers, but new monsters like the IS-2 heavy tank. With a 122mm gun that could blast through bunkers and tear German armor apart, the IS-2 was built for the final brutal push. Against the worn-down German defenders, there was little left that could stand in their way. Looking back, the story of tanks in World War II isn't just about bigger guns or thicker armor. It's about who could think faster, build smarter, and adapt on the fly. Germany started the war with daring new tactics, but the Allies, and especially the Americans and Soviets, outpaced them. They learned from early mistakes, ramped up production, and turned tanks from battlefield experiments into the centerpiece of modern warfare. And even when the shooting finally stopped in 1945, the lessons of those battles didn't fade away. They shaped everything that came next. From the Cold War to the battlefields of the future, the age of the tank was just getting started. So in the end, tank warfare in World War II wasn't just about machines. It was about ideas, strategy, and the race to adapt faster than the enemy. If you're interested in more fascinating history content, make sure to click on the next video.